Betty was a young woman, just 27 years old, with bright, curious eyes and gentle smile that could light up any room. She'd grown up in a small village where life was simple and dreams were small. For as long as she could remember, Betty had wished for more, a life beyond the dust roads and the quiet fields for her home. She imagined herself working in a big house, wearing a clean apron, working for a wealthy family. So when she got a job as a maid in a grand mansion, her heart swelled with excitement. She was nervous but hopeful, ready to start the new chapter of her life. The mansion was enormous, like something out of a fairy tale. It had tall windows that sparkled in sunlight, long hallways that seemed to stretch forever, and beautiful gardens filled with flowers of every color. Betty had never seen such a place before. Every corner of the mansion seemed to whisper stories of old times and hidden secrets. She was in awe of the grand stairs, the shiny marble floors, and the rooms filled with fancy furniture. She knew she was just a maid, but she felt like she had stepped into a different world. Betty worked hard from the very first day. She cleaned the floor until they shined like mirrors, polished the silverware until she could see her reflection, and made beds with the neatest corners. She cooked delicious meals and served with a smile, and did her best to make everyone in the house happy. The mansion belonged to Mr. David, a wealthy man who lived there with his wife and Mrs. Grace and their 3 children. Mr. David was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes. He often watched Betty as she worked, and sometimes she felt his gaze linger a bit too long. She thought he was just being kind, like a father looking after his own child. But she couldn't understand why his eyes seemed so soft whenever he looked at her. At first, Betty thought nothing of it. She was focusing on doing her job well and fitting into this new life. She was grateful for the opportunity to work in such a beautiful place, and tried to ignore the strange feelings in her stomach every time Mr. David smiled at her. But as days turned into weeks, Betty began to notice little things that made her curious. Mr. David often asked her how she was feeling, if she was happy, and if she needed anything. She even gave her some gifts when the nights were cold, or a book when he noticed she liked to read in her spare time. Betty felt a mix of emotions. She was happy to receive kindness, but also confused. Why did Mr. David care so much about her? She had only been there for a short time. She told herself not to think too much about it. After all, she was just a maid in a big house. She had no family, no connections, but deep down, a tiny voice whispered that there might be more to the story than she knew. She decided to keep her head down and focus on her work, but the feeling of the mystery grew stronger each passing day. Little did she know, her life was about to change in a way she never could have imagined. Betty had stepped into the world of secrets, and soon the biggest secret of all would be revealed. On the rainy evening, the wind howled around the mansion, rattling the windows and making the tall trees in the garden swell like giants. Betty was finishing up her chores in the kitchen, wiping the counters and cleaning up the last dishes. She was tired after a long day of work, but she felt a strange nervousness in the air, a feeling that something unusual was about to happen. As she was about to head to her small room in the servants' quarter, Mr. David appeared at a doorway, his face serious yet gentle. "Betty," he said quietly, "could you please come to my study? I have something important to discuss with you." Betty's heart skipped a beat. She had never been called into Mr. David's study before. The study was a place of importance, where big decisions were made and serious talks were held. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Mr. David up to the grand staircase, her footsteps echoing in the long, empty hallway. The sound of the rain outside grew louder, drumming against the windows, as if urging her to hurry. When they reached the study, Mr. David closed the wooden door behind them. The room was dimly lit, with fire crackling in the place and a large desk covered in papers and books. Betty stood nervously, unsure of what to expect. She could feel her hands trembling a little, and she clasped them together to steady herself. Mr. David took a deep breath and sat down in a large chair, looking at her with eyes that were filled with something she couldn't quite understand. Was it worry, regret, love? "Betty," he began slowly, "I have kept a secret from you, and it's time you know the truth. You are my daughter." Betty felt the room spin. She blinked, thinking she must have heard wrong. "Your daughter?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the crackling fire. Mr. David nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes, Betty. Many years ago, before I married Mrs. Grace, I loved a woman named Mary. She was beautiful and kind, but we parted ways before I knew she was expecting a child. When I learned about you, it was too late. Mary had left with you, and I didn't know where you were. I spent years searching, hoping to find you." Betty's heart pounded in her chest. She felt as if she couldn't breathe. She had always wondered who her father was, but she never imagined it would be him, Mr. David, the owner of the mansion where she worked. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't know if they were tears of happiness or confusion. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I was afraid," Mr. David replied, his voice soft and full of emotions. "I didn't know how you would react, or if you would even want to know me. I wanted to be sure before I told you, but now I want you to be part of my life. Betty, you are my child, and you belong here." Betty felt a rush of emotions, joy, confusion, fear, and even a bit of hunger. She didn't know what to say. Her whole life she had wondered who her father was, and now she knew. But what would it mean for her? Would Mrs. Grace and the children accept her? She looked at Mr. David, trying to read his face, trying to find answers. Just then, the door of the study cracked open, and Mrs. Grace stood there, her face pale with shock. Behind her were the children, their eyes widened and mouths open in surprise. They had heard everything. The secret was out, and there was no turning back. Betty felt her stomach twist with worry. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew that everything had changed in an instant. She braced herself for a storm that was about to happen. Mrs. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, her face turning pale with shock and hunger. She wouldn't believe what she had just heard. Her husband, Mr. David, had a daughter with another woman, a daughter who had been living under her roof, working as a maid without her knowledge. Betty could see the fear in Mrs. Grace's eyes, and her heart began to race. The children huddled behind their mother, whispered to one another, their eyes darting from Betty to their father. "How could you? How could you?" Mrs. Grace finally managed to say. her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and rage. "How could you keep such a secret from us? From me?" Mr. David stood up slowly, his face calm and filled with regret. "Grace, I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you or the children. I only found Betty a few months ago, and I wanted to be sure it was the right time." "The right time?" Mrs. Grace interrupted, her voice rising. "There was never going to be a right time for something like this." She turned to Betty, her eyes narrowing. "And you? Did you know about this? Were you trying to take what is ours?" Betty felt a lump in her throat. "No, Mrs. Grace," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea. I came here only to work. I didn't know he was my father until today." But Mrs. Grace wasn't listening. She waved her hand as if to dismiss Betty's words. "This changes everything," she said sharply. "You may be his daughter, but you are not my daughter, and you'll never be part of this family." The children, who had been silent, now started to mutter among themselves. "Is she really our sister?" one of them asked. "Do we have to call her that?" another whispered. The youngest child, a little girl with curly hair, looked up at Betty with big, curious eyes. Betty felt her heart inch. She had always wanted siblings, but not like this. Not in such a hostile and cold way. Mr. David tried to calm his wife and children. "Please, everyone, let's talk about this calmly. Betty has done nothing wrong. She deserves a chance to be part of our family." But Mrs. Grace was not ready to listen. "I will not have her here," she snapped. "She can stay as a maid, but she will never be treated as one of us. Do you understand, David? Never." Betty's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to run, to hide, but she knew she couldn't. She had to stay strong. She had finally found her father, but it seemed she had also found a battle. Mrs. Grace stormed out of the room, pulling the children with her, leaving Betty and Mr. David alone in the cold, empty study. "I'm sorry, Betty," Mr. David whispered, reaching out to touch her arm, but she pulled away, unsure of what to feel. "I promise I'll make things right. Just give me some time." Betty nodded, but inside she felt a whirlwind of emotions. She had finally found her father, but instead of joy, she felt lost, scared and alone. She had no idea how the days ahead would unfold, but she knew one thing for a certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As she left the study, she could hear the hushed voices of Mrs. Grace and the children, filled with hunger and resentment. Betty knew she had to be strong. She had to survive in this house, even if it meant facing the cold stares and harsh words of the family she had once hoped would welcome her. Outside, the rain poured harder, as if echoing the storm that had just erupted inside the mansion. Betty made her way back to her small room, her heart heavy with worry. She felt like an intruder in the place that was supposed to be her home, and the road ahead looked darker than ever. But deep inside, a tiny spark of hope remained. Maybe, just maybe, things would change. The days that followed were harder than Betty could ever imagined. Mrs. Grace made sure Betty knew she wasn't welcome. The orders were harsher and the work was heavier, and the cold stares from other servants who quickly learned the secret made Betty feel like she was carrying a weight of the world on her shoulder. Every day seemed like the test of patience and strength. She could feel the tension in every corner of the mansion, and every task seemed to take twice as long because of the heavy burden she felt in her heart. At meal times, Betty was made to eat alone in the kitchen, far from the dining room where Mrs. Grace and the children and Mr. David sat together. Even though Mr. David looked troubled and tried to speak up for her, Mr. Grace's sharp glances and pointed words kept him silent. The children, who once had smiled at Betty and asked her to play with them, now whispered behind her back, casting suspicious glances whenever she passed by. The youngest little girl with curly hair, she looked at her with curiosity, but even she seemed unsure. Betty did her best to stay strong. She continued to work hard, doing her chores without complaint, even when Mrs. Grace found fault in everything she did. If Betty polished the silver, Mrs. Grace would find a spot she missed. If she cleansed the floor, Mrs. Grace would find a patch of dust. Every day Betty felt more like an outsider, even though she was supposed to be part of the family. One afternoon, while she was dusting the bookshelf in the grand library, Betty overheard Mrs. Grace talk with her children in the hallway. "We do not speak to her unless it is necessary," Mrs. Grace instructed them. "She may be your father's child, but she's not one of us. Remember that. Keep a distance." Betty's heart sank as she heard the children agree, their voices filled with uncertainty and confusion. She fought back tears, knowing she had to be strong. She could not let them see her cry. She felt like she was a stranger in what was supposed to be her home, and she had no idea how to change that. That night, Betty lay awake in her small cold room, staring at the ceiling. She missed the warmth of a real family. She missed the comfort of belonging. She wondered if she could ever leave, but where would she go? She had no family, no place to call home. Her thoughts kept squealing like a storm outside, and she felt more lost than ever. The next morning, things got even worse. Mrs. Grace had spread rumors among the servants, whispering that Betty was trying to take over the house, that she was just a greedy girl who wanted Mr. David's money. The servants, once friendly, now treated Betty with suspicion and hostility. They muttered as she passed by, and some even refused to speak to her. Betty felt their eyes on her back, felt their coldness in every room she entered. Despite everything, Mr. David tried to be kind to Betty whenever he could. He could leave some notes of encouragement, telling her to stay strong and that he would find a way to make things right. But even this support seemed to anger Mrs. Grace more. She began to limit his time with Betty, finding reason to keep him busy away from the mansion. Betty realized she was truly alone in this house of strangers. Her hope began to waver, but deep down she knew she had to stay. She had to hold on for her father's sake and for herself. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to give up, no matter how hard the days become. Betty's heart raced. What could he want to say? Was there more to the secret? Was there a way to end all this pain? She had no idea what awaited her in the garden, but she knew she had to find out. As she closed her eyes that night, she felt a small spark of hope ignite once more, flickering against the darkness. The storm had just begun, but Betty was determined to weather it. At the break of dawn, Betty slipped out of her small room, carefully not to awake anyone in the quiet mansion. The first light of the morning was just peeking through the trees, casting long shadows across the drew glass. Betty wrapped a scarf around her shoulders to keep out the chill as she made her way to the garden. Her heart thundered with both excitement and fear. What was so important that Mr. David wanted to speak with her in secret? When he reached the garden, she found Mr. David waiting near the old stone bench, his face lined with worry. He turned when he heard her footsteps and smiled, but his eyes looked tired, as if he didn't sleep all night. Betty walked up to him, her hands nervously clenching the edge of her scroll. "Thank you for coming, Betty," he said quietly. "I know things have been difficult, and I'm sorry for all the pain this has caused you." Betty nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you want to tell me, Father?" Mr. David took a deep breath. "There is something you need to know," he began. "Something more than just a secret of your birth. I fear Grace has plans to make your life here even harder. She believes you are a threat to her and the children. She's trying to turn everyone against you. I'm afraid she won't stop until she drives you." Betty's heart sank. She felt the hostility growing, but to hear it confirmed made her stomach twist and worry. "What should I do?" she asked, feeling lost. "I don't want to cause any trouble, but I also don't want to leave. You are my father. This is supposed to be my home too." Mr. David nodded, his expression troubled. "I know, Betty. I want you to stay. You belong here, and I want to make things right for you. But I fear your safety. I think it's best if you stay away from Grace and the children as much as possible. Just for a while, keep your distance and don't give her any reason to accuse you of anything." Betty felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you think she would hurt me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mr. David hesitated for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I've seen a side of Grace that I've never seen before, and I fear she's more desperate than I realized. Just promise me you'll be careful, Betty. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks." Betty nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. "I promise, Father, I'll be careful." Mr. David reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "Good. I'll try to speak to Grace again to make her see a reason. But if things get worse, I want you to come to me immediately. Don't try to handle this on your own." Betty nodded again, though deep down she felt a growing sense of dread. She could see the worry in her father's eyes, and she knew that whatever lay ahead, it would not be easy. As they stood there in the early morning light, Betty heard a rustle in the bushes nearby. She turned her head quickly, her heart pounding. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Mr. David nodded, his expression suddenly alert. "Someone might be watching," he whispered back. "We should end this conversation now. Go back to your room, Betty, and be careful." Betty nodded and turned to leave, but as she walked back towards the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder but saw nothing. The garden seemed empty, but she couldn't be sure. As she reached the back door of the mansion, she glanced one last time towards the bush. Was it her imagination, or had she seen a shadow move? She hurried inside, her heart racing, and closed the door quietly behind her. She knew now that she needed to be more careful than ever. Betty decided to stay in her room for most of the day, coming out when necessary. She kept her eyes open, watching everyone around her, trying to see who might be an enemy and who might be a friend. But in this house, even a friend could turn into an enemy with a whisper of Mrs. Grace. She waited for a nightfall, wondering what would happen next, and feeling more alone than ever. She had a father now, but she also had more enemies than she could count. The mansion felt like a beautiful prison, and Betty knew that if she wasn't careful, it could become her cage forever. The days passed slowly, each one feeling longer and heavier than the last. Betty kept herself staying mostly in her room and only coming out when it was necessary to complete her chores. She moved like shadow, silent and unseen, hoping to avoid any confrontation. But the tension in the mansion grew thicker with every passing day, like a storm brewing on the horizon. One evening, as Betty was finishing up her tasks in the kitchen, she heard a hushed voice coming from the hallway. She paused, straining her ears to listen. It was Mrs. Grace and one of the servants, Mary, a woman who had always been kind to her. But now, even Mary seemed to be on edge, her voice low and nervous. "She's still here, isn't she?" Mrs. Grace whispered sharply. "Betty won't leave and David is still trying to protect her, but I won't let her ruin everything. She thinks she belongs here, but she doesn't. She has to go. Do you understand, Mary?" "Yes, madam," Mary replied, her voice shaky. "What do you want me to do?" "Keep an eye on her," Mrs. Grace ordered. "Watch her every move. Report back to me if she does anything suspicious. We need to find any reason to get her out of this house. Do you understand?" Mary's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. She felt a wave of fear and hunger rise inside her. Mrs. Grace was planning something, and she was using the servants to help her. Betty knew she had to be even more careful now. She couldn't trust anyone, not even Mary, who had once been her friend. That night, as Betty lay in her bed, she tried to come up with a plan. She knew she couldn't just leave the mansion. She had nowhere else to go, but she also knew she couldn't let Mrs. Grace win. She had to stay strong, stay alert, and find a way to protect herself. She remembered her father's words, "Come to me if things get worse." But how could she reach him when Mrs. Grace kept him away from her every time, at every opportunity? As she tossed and turned, she heard a faint knock on her door. Betty froze, her heart racing. Who could it be at this hour? She wondered. She tiptoed to the door and slowly opened it, just a crack. It was Mary, her face pale and her eyes widened with fear. "Betty, can I come in?" she whispered gently. Betty hesitated for a moment, then nodded and let Mary in. Mary quickly closed the door behind her, glancing nervously down the hallway. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I had to warn you." "Warn me? About what?" Betty asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Mrs. Grace," Mary replied, wrinkling her hands. "She's planning something. I don't know what, but it's not good. She's been talking to some people in town, trying to find a way to get you out of the house for good. She's desperate. Betty, desperate people do dangerous things." Betty felt a chill run down her spine. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Still worry. I heard you talking to her today, agreeing to spy on me. Mary looked ashamed, tears swelling in her eyes. I'm sorry, Betty, she whispered. I didn't want to, but she threatened me. She said if I didn't do what she asked, she would make sure I lose my job. I have children to feed. I didn't know what to do, but I wouldn't just let her hurt you. Betty sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. Thank you for telling me, Mary, she said quietly. What should I do? I can't leave. I have no other home, and my father, he wants me to stay. Mary nodded, wiping her tears. I don't know, Betty, she replied. Her voice is full of worry. But please be careful. Don't trust anyone, not even other servants. Mrs. Green has clue in everyone. You must protect yourself. Betty nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. I will, she promised, and thank you, Mary. You are a true friend. Mary gave a small, sad smile. I hope so, she whispered before slipping back into the hall wall, disappearing into the darkness. Betty closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. She knew now that things were more dangerous than she realized. Mrs. Grace was desperate and willing to do anything to get rid of her. Betty needed a plan, and she needed it fast. She had to find a way to protect herself and stay close to her father. As she laid back down, she stared up at the ceiling, her mind filled with 1,000 thoughts. The shadows seemed to dance in the corners of her room, whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. She felt the weight of the mansion pressing down on her, as if it were alive and hungry. But Betty refused to be afraid. She had already faced so much, and she wasn't going to back down now. I will not leave, she whispered to herself in the dark. I'll fight, I'll stay. This is my home too. And with that, she closed her eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and dangers, but also a chance to prove her strength. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for reaching this far. This story is so amazing. This is part 1, guys. This is part 1 of the story, but you can see how amazing it is. It is so addictive. Suspicious is here, emotions, all that you can talk about in the stories, it's here. And just leave something in the comment section. Just let me know what you think of it. Just let me know. How do stepmothers treat their stepchildren? Just put it in the comment section. And please, if you've not yet subscribed to this channel, kindly subscribe to see what is coming next. Because right now, Betty is now brave enough to face Mrs. Green or to face any other challenge that is coming her way. So what is coming next in part 2? So that's why I want you to subscribe and hit that notification bell, in that you'll be notified wherever I post a video. I don't want to leave you guys behind. Let's move together. Let's enjoy this journey together. The happiness, the sadness, we enjoy all that together. We cry, we laugh together. So let me leave you guys. See you in my next video. I love you all. Bye-bye.